Resuming debate, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Indigenous and Northern Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank all of those in the House of Commons today that have contributed to this important debate on children in First Nations across Canada. I want to add my voice to this debate as well. Our government promised a new relationship with Indigenous people and a commitment to work in partnership to resolve the important issues of discrimination that have impacted Indigenous people for generations, especially children. So, Mr. Speaker, we on this side of the House, we're grateful for this debate today because we once again can bring to light the issues and the need to reform First Nations child and family service programs. That is a goal of our government, one we take seriously and one that we are determined, Mr. Speaker, to be able to do. I can assure all colleagues in the House today that we recognize as a government that this is urgent work that requires urgent attention. Our priority is first and foremost on the well-being of children, and we remain committed to working collaboratively to implement the orders of the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, which has been stated in the motion provided by the member today. We have made very clear what our commitment to working to improve the outcomes for First Nation communities, which is why we have welcomed the Tribunal's decision and have worked diligently in partnership to address the orders that have been outlined. Mr. Speaker, we will not defend the actions of former governments. We will not defend the neglect that have been created by former governments as it relates to Indigenous people. Our government is looking forward. We are looking forward to addressing these urgent and important needs that are required by First Nations children and First Nations communities. We know that essentially we have a system of child welfare and family services in this country to First Nations people that is broken, and it needs to be overhauled. I was hoping today that in the motion presented by the member opposite that he would speak to the fact that there needs to be full reform in this system, because I know he believes it needs to happen. Our government believes that meaningful change for First Nations children and for families can only be successful if all partners are included in developing this path forward, including First Nations youth, First Nations leadership, First Nations children, First Nations families, key organizers, service providers, federal departments, provincial government, and territorial government departments as well. We are committed to a full-scale reform of the program that is developed with and for First Nations, and we are reaching out to all of those partners in the country to encourage their contribution and those options for reform. That includes reaching out to members in this legislature. That's why this debate has become important today in seeking that feedback. Our government is committed to changing the status quo, and we're taking action to ensure that we get this right for First Nations children and families. They deserve to have a government that is not only committed to reform and transforming the Child Welfare and Family Services Act in this country for First Nations, but they deserve to have a government as well that will take action, seek their input, and get this right for them. It is time in this country, Mr. Speaker, that we shape reform that is going to benefit and help the people that really need it. Far too long there has been decisions made that have been top-down. That's why we have the situation we do in this country today. That's why many First Nations, Inuit and Métis communities across our country feel they have been neglected. And realistically, they have been. Not just their children, but their communities as a whole. They deserve a government who realizes the urgency of this issue, and they have one in us. Mr. Speaker, immediately this year we moved to make investments for children and families on reserve. We knew that the investments were needed and they were urgent. Through Budget 2016, we made significant investments in First Nations children and family service programs, with nearly $635 million over 5 years in new funding, including $71 million this year for immediate urgent relief that was focused on providing additional prevention services in each province and in the Yukon Territory. Mr. Speaker, that was a historic move that never happened in any government prior, Mr. Speaker, but it happened in this government in less than 12 months because we take our job and obligation to Indigenous children in this country and to Indigenous people seriously, and we are acting. Through, Mr. Speaker, in addition to that, through Child and Family Services Canada, we also committed in urgent investments up to $382 million over the next 3 years to implement a new approach to Jordan's Principle. This new approach will include enhanced service coordination, a service access resolution fund, and these steps will ensure that First Nations children have access to the care and supports that they need, and that Canada can effectively respond to First Nations children and their needs. Mr. Speaker, I could speak for a lengthy period of time on this issue, but I am going to be splitting my time, Mr. Speaker, with the member for Vancouver Centre, and I know that this is an issue that she as well is very passionate about. But before I finish, Mr. Speaker, there's a couple of things I want to say. A country like Canada, there should be no ruling in any court that says that racial systemic discrimination, discriminatory actions towards Aboriginal children exist. It is a shameful ruling for any court to have to make in this country, and we will be the first government stepping up to address this, to ensure that systemic discrimination against children on reserve, off reserve, First Nations, Inuit and Métis no longer occur in this country. Mr. Speaker, the courts made this ruling because the former government for 10 years under Prime Minister Harper did not see the value of investing in First Nations, Inuit and Métis children in this country, or even in the communities in which they live, or even, Mr. Speaker, in the people that make up those many communities across our country. They continue to cut funding, not improve funding. They continue to ignore the plight that children were underfunded and left in poverty in these communities. It's only the government of the day that is stepping up, Mr. Speaker, to ask for real reform, to lead real reform in the child welfare and family services in this country for First Nations people. Mr. Speaker, we believe on this side that no one should have to use the court as a government to fight children, but that's what happened in the former government. They might have great speeches and a change of heart today, but it's disappointing to know that they also fought these children in court so they would not have to increase funding to First Nations and Indigenous children in this country. Mr. Speaker, we're committed to reform. We're committed to supporting First Nations. We're going to keep working towards that goal. We're going to keep working to help Indigenous families and children. I have a riding, Mr. Speaker, where we talk about residential schools and removing children out of communities. We talk about the 60 scoop, but today I look around and there's more children in care in the communities that I represent and many other Indigenous communities across the country than we've ever seen before. We have to stop this. We have to stop this. We have to help children stay in their own communities, help families stay together, help children grow up in the culture that they're a part of. I see too many children being taken away and sent away where families of non-Indigenous families get more money to care for Indigenous children than Indigenous families do. These are the things we have to fix. These are the things that we're committed to fix. And I will tell you, Mr. Speaker, I am proud of the work that our government has done towards children and First Nations, Inuit and Métis people in this country, and we're going to keep doing it.